Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. Today I'm joined once again by my good friend Bernie to talk about Jonathan Demme's multiple Oscar-winning psychological thriller The Silence of the Lambs, in which a young FBI agent, Clarice Starling, played by Jodie Foster, seeks the help of imprisoned serial killer Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins, to catch another elusive killer. The film went on to win a resounding 5 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins winning Best Male and Female Leading Roles. The film is currently streaming on Netflix. Bernie, welcome to the show.
I appreciate you having me back, man. How are you doing?
Not too bad, Again, another week, another movie to review with you. So I'm happy that I've been able to work you into the rotation more.
I am too. It's just we always choose these crazy psychological movies, and I have to kind of decompress and watch like Curb Your Enthusiasm afterwards to get back to a normal basis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm the same way. I've been rewatching like It's Always Sunny in Philly as soon as we finish because we seem to pick some pretty heavy movies, but each movie we pick, no matter how heavy it is, we seem to get a pretty good conversation out of it. So at least there's that.
Exactly. I mean, I think this one, from all the ones that we've talked about, Silence of the Lambs is just such a unique film. And there's just the director just does a phenomenal job of, again, keeping us guessing of kind of where the story is developing. Who are the kind of real antagonists in this? Is it Buffalo Bill? Is it really Anthony Hopkins' character, Hannibal Lecter? I mean, it's just a phenomenal movie for us to kind of review and talk about.
Yeah, so I'm kind of interested, like, what is your experience with the world of Hannibal Lecter? There's like multiple novels that the films are based on. There's multiple films. Had you seen this before?
Yeah, so I've seen this one before. I believe there's a follow-up to this as well that's based in Italy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so the sequel was directed by Ridley Scott, and that was called Red Dragon. No, that was called Hannibal, excuse me. And then they did a sequel to that was called Red Dragon.
That's a sequel, okay. So I've seen all 3 of those then. I'm familiar that there is some sort of a series, if it's on Netflix or Hulu. I'm not familiar exactly with that, but I haven't had the chance to look at it yet. But I think, when you have such an iconic character like, Hannibal Lecter, specifically with Anthony Hopkins playing him, it's hard to recreate that in a way that's kind of palpable or really, it kind of, it suffices what you're kind of looking for out of one of these kind of crazy horror thriller type of movies. I mean, out of all 3 of those movies, in that trilogy, I guess you could say, I think this one obviously is the best one. Just the twists and turns that it takes on us. And again, just the way the director kind of frames it from start to finish. It's just such a captivating movie to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is definitely the strongest of that trilogy because they did make a 4th movie, and then the series that you mentioned that's on Netflix right now, the Hannibal TV series, is actually a prequel to this. So this, I think, is really strong. And in a rewatch, because I had only seen this once before, on a rewatch, I guess the first time you watch this movie, you're so captivated by Anthony Hopkins, how creepy he is, how disturbing, how he blends being a psychopath, but yet he's like charming and intelligent at the same time, that it almost kind of overshadows Jodie Foster a little bit. And the fact that, like, on a rewatch, her role is so outside of the norm, especially for kind of these detective thrillers of the era, because this came out in 91, I believe. And just seeing such a strong female protagonist in a movie that from the outset seems like it's going to be very procedural, but it kind of goes in a lot of different directions and blending of genres that I wasn't really expecting.
Right. I mean, obviously it's 2020 now. We're a little bit, into the future in that sense, compared to what they were dealing with back then. But just in terms of like how Clarice Starling was treated throughout that whole movie, she's such a phenomenal character. And, the woman that plays her, Jodie Foster, she does such a great job of kind of you see all the varying emotions that a character can have in that, from being absolutely disgusted where that, crazy prisoner, when she goes down the first time to see Hannibal Lecter, and, he throws a bodily fluid, let's just say, on her.
Yeah, that's putting it
Yeah,
nicely.
to her trying to have those conversations and kind of growing confidence in understanding who Hannibal Lecter is. And then again, to fast forward even to, towards that ending when she realizes she's actually in the house of Buffalo Bill and she thought she was just speaking to, I think it was Mrs. Lipkin's son or something like that.
Yeah.
So just the array of emotions that she shows as a character, I mean, I'm not sure if she won any kind of awards for this, but if she didn't, it's criminal in that sense.
No, she did. So she won Best Leading Actress that year. She won an Oscar for that. But yeah, I think I definitely agree. Like it's very much a strong female role in a world that is male dominated. And we see, like you said, a lot of ways that she's an outsider basically throughout the entire movie. Like not only is she an outsider in this world of going from FBI trainee to meeting and being forced to interview one of the most deadly serial killers ever. And then we also have the fact that she's an outsider just in the world in general. Like she's a woman in a man's world. And we see that throughout just like the very first interaction that she has with someone not in the FBI is with Dr. Chilton, who plays the head of the insane asylum where Hannibal Lecter's residing. And like within the first 30 seconds, he's hitting on her and he's talking about like taking her out on the town and all this stuff and just like all this kind of he's a sleazy dude. And then she kind of just like rebukes all of his advances basically in a way that's not over the top. She kind of treats it like she's used to it in a way. But it's kind of just like the very early example of like the world is hostile to her in multiple ways. Like obviously it's less severe when it's just men hitting on you compared to being in a room with a serial killer. But at the same time, like that's still her pushing against unwanted behavior throughout the entire movie that kind of makes it intense in a way that I didn't pick up on the first time.
Right, exactly. I mean, even to they're at the coroner's office where after they're evaluating like one of the bodies that they find in the lake, right? And they find like I can't remember if it was like a moth shell or
it was a moth cocoon.
Excuse me. Apparently I know a lot about this stuff, so I apologize. But they find that, and she takes it to some sort of animal kind of expert that understands this stuff. And even then, when they're analyzing it, one of those guys, is like, "Do you like some sort of wine?" And she's just, amusing the conversation. I think in this particular case, and a lot of women could probably relate to this, is that there's going to be times where even doesn't matter how important or how serious a nature is, guys will be guys in that sense. So to be able to kind of push through that and still come out with such a strong character in that sense, again, I think she just did a phenomenal job in this role.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see her become more and more confident the longer that the movie goes on and the more in depth that she becomes involved in the case, because we learn fairly early on that the only reason that Jack Crawford picked her, like the whole time we're kind of wondering, like, why the hell is he picking some trainee that has no real experience? And the whole idea is that she's attractive. And so Jack Crawford assumes that, oh, if I send this attractive woman down to go interview Hannibal Lecter, it'll shake him basically. And he'll either reveal a piece of information because they want her to interview him to reveal different clues and facts about Buffalo Bill, who's another serial killer that's been skinning women. I think he's killed 5 people so far. But it's kind of this idea that like she's just being manipulated the whole time. And you mentioned the morgue that they go to visit. And it's like she's there, but as soon as she gets there, like everybody's looking down on her basically. Like all those cops are kind of just like mad dogging her. They don't even want her in the room for some of the important conversations. But then her intellect kind of like forces them to accept her within the investigation because she's the one that ends up like breaking the case essentially.
Right. I mean, specifically to that point, as they're in that scene, Jack Crawford, played by Scott Glenn, again, who's also phenomenal in this movie. He, the lead sheriff or detective, like on the local precinct level, they start a dialogue, and he starts telling him a little bit about like the graphic nature of what happened. And even Jack, who, Jack Crawford, who knows what Clarice Starling is, he understands that she can take some of this stuff in terms of like the intimate details and just the graphic nature of what happened. And even at that point, he's like, let's move this conversation somewhere else, and looks right at her, and the kind of camera pans to her. So even when she's had all these conversations with Hannibal Lecter, she's brought so much to the case already, and they're hiding certain things from her, or not knowing or not being able to think that she can handle some of this. And it's just, again, it's one more of those sprinkles of kind of a minor insult that she has to deal with throughout the movie.
Yeah, absolutely. A little note that during my research, I never knew that Michelle Pfeiffer, who was from Scarface and Batman Returns, was supposed to be the Jodie Foster role originally. And it's just like, I could never imagine anybody else being in the Jodie Foster role. Like I said earlier, I've only seen this movie once, but it's such a defining role for her career because of just like how unassuming she seems. And yet she ends up breaking the case. Like she should have Jack Crawford's job, essentially. Like it's very rare in these types of movies. Well, I don't know if it's rare, but especially for that era, it was outside of the box in terms of like, this female protagonist who happens to be like lovely and whatnot is the smartest one in the room in a majority of the scenes. Like she kind of exposes the fact, like that trope of the feds being mindless or being inept at trying to solve different things. And we even see that at the end of the movie. They think that they've tracked down Buffalo Bill, and then they storm a house and it's just some empty house. And yet Clarice Starling, this 5-foot-something woman now, is the one that's interviewing this behemoth of a serial killer.
That scene, the juxtaposition of them, the SWAT team kind of coming in, they're hiding behind some sort of like a floral van, agents kind of everywhere, and then you're seeing Buffalo Bill, dancing around that girl, trying to, get the dog down into that hole or pit that she's in, and then the doorbell rings a couple of times, and then it's they break in, obviously, but it's Clarice when the door opens. And again, in your mind, you're thinking, okay, they got him. We're all good. Everyone's pretty much in the clear. And then that last 20 minutes, I think that made this movie, especially watching it a second time, so much more good, just because, and so much more interesting, just off of the fact that you've invested all this time now, and you think that you're going to see this, and nothing happens on one end, and the heart drops on the other, because you're like, oh fuck, like you see the, apologies for the swear, by the way, but you see the,
that's okay, it's an M-rated show.
Perfect. Well, yeah, so then you realize that she's kind of screwed when you see the moth flying around, and there's the the sewing kits and stuff like that that's invisible for her, or invisible range in that sense, and right. Again, you're just like, oh shit, all right, so where is this about to go? And you see Jack Crawford, it pans to him when they realize that there's no one in there, and he goes, Clarice. And again, just reinforces this notion that, all right, she's on her own now, all these people that have underestimated her, and now it's basically, the ball's in her court, essentially. And to see how that kind of came together was just insane.
It's basically like the worst case scenario ever for her. But that's a fantastic example, because that scene, actually, I was listening to an interview, and that scene originally, they didn't juxtapose it like that. It wasn't kind of cut together, because we get those various cuts you said, like we see the agents moving in, we cut down to the basement. So through that editing, we assume that the FBI is at the right house, because the doorbell's ringing and stuff, but it ends up being Clarice. Originally, those two scenes played out one after the other. So it was the FBI breaking into a house, and then it was the doorbell ringing, and then it was Clarice at the front door when they originally were doing that. But then as soon as they watched the first rough cut, they were like, there's no suspense in this scene. Like, this is terrible. So then they went back and they started editing it and chopping it up and mixing it to what I think is one of the most tense scenes of the entire movie.
I mean, there's a number of super tense scenes. I don't know if I don't know if you could pick out which I guess is the most tense scene, just because again, when you're thinking about that situation with Hannibal Lecter when he's in that hotel or whatever building that they're kind of holding
I think it's a courthouse.
courthouse, and there's police everywhere, and then you see him kind of take out that piece of the pen that he had. I don't know if he had swallowed the pen or what exactly he did with that.
Probably had it under his tongue or
Yeah,
something.
just normal kind of a thing that would.
Yeah.
Uh,
You know, it comes in handy when you're a serial killer.
right, right. I mean, I personally wouldn't know.
You know, that's for another podcast and another day.
Yeah, please. No, but you know, to see that kind of little, you know, piece of that pen come out of his mouth, and then you see it kind of in between his fingers as he's going to get handcuffed, and again, that suspense builds where you're like, I know where this is going, but this can't, like, there's cops everywhere, right? Like, they have this guy secured, and the way that whole scene played out, I mean, I think that's probably one of the like top 10 or top 15 most suspenseful like scenes that I've ever seen in film. Because
yeah, I mean, somehow we managed to pick Silence of the Lambs, and we've gotten 15 minutes in, and we haven't mentioned Anthony Hopkins' performance in any depth. So I had misremembered just how terrifying his performance was. The opening introduction to his character, I had forgotten, was just Clarice is walking down by all the cells. She's seeing these very unstable serial killers that are housed there, or just killers. And we see the first thing we see is that his cell is different than everybody else's. Everybody else has these steel bars that you would assume. His, though, is just plexiglass. So immediately, like, visually, we're cued in that he is different in somehow. And we don't really know anything about him up until that point. And then once she gets closer and closer, we see that while everybody else is sitting or standing, or they're sitting at a table, or they're sitting in bed, or they're like hanging over the bars, Hannibal Lecter's just like hanging out there, like waiting for her, which is just like the most sinister, unnerving introduction to a character that you could have.
I think that I can't remember if it was the first interaction or second interaction they had, but there's a moment where Barney and Chilton are kind of explaining to her who Hannibal really is, like just giving a more in-depth description about him, and they show her a picture that we never actually see. But the way they describe the picture and so essentially what happened was he had, I forget if it was a stroke or some sort of an issue. He got sent to the infirmary, and they took off like the mask that he was wearing, essentially the face holster, I guess, and someone's like basically cheek off, an eye off, and the way that they're describing it was more harrowing than ever even looking at that photo. And just the way the script writing and the way that they did like the cinematography for this made it so much more suspenseful that when you actually see Anthony Hopkins and you see this, he's a relatively old man, but he looks kind of slick, and he's obviously very intelligent, and the way that he begins his conversation with her, and then the depths of which it gets to, it starts out relatively pleasant, and towards the second conversation they have, he's basically calling her like a whore and saying that she's like white trash from West Virginia, and it's like this guy just has such a more deeper understanding of people, and it's again, it's fascinating to watch all that unfold and getting that glimpse of Anthony Hopkins' character in that.
Yeah, that's a great point that you bring up about how that scene where they're telling Clarice about an injury that a nurse sustained, because Hannibal Lecter basically fakes an injury so that he can go to the medical bay, which is going to be somewhat isolated. Just the fact that they're telling us rather than showing us, which is usually not the case in writing. Obviously, most of the time you want to show and not tell. But in terms, since it's a movie, like, it's incredibly effective, and it's more so effective than if they just show us an image, a gory image, basically. Right. And that's really a testament to Ted Talley, who's the person that adapted Thomas Harris's novel, Silence of the Lambs. His screenplay adapting it is filled with these examples of things where we're told things more often than we're shown. And since it's so interconnected and interwoven with the few actual scenes that have violence, it makes it that much more effective. And I think even simpler, I guess by today's standards, you'd think that they're simple, like when Hannibal beats one of the guards to death with the baton. Like, we've seen plenty of things like that, but the fact that been, it's coming after all of these kind of like disturbing descriptions, and then once you actually see the violence unfold on screen, I found it to be more disturbing.
Very much so. I mean, you know, I think the baton beating in that specific scene was the least of their worries.
Yeah.
I still don't necessarily understand what he was trying to illuminate with that guard that he had basically hung up. Like, he looked like.
I think it was, I'm Hannibal Lecter, and if you fuck with me, I'm gonna gut you and hang you up from the rafters.
You know, this is a weird side note, but how long do you think it would take for you to do that? I mean, that's like a grown man, 200 pounds. You're just gonna lift him up. There's like an American flag hanging between them. I mean, he had some serious time to do that, or some serious strength. I mean, that's.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the elements of the films that translates to the TV show in the most disturbing way possible, in that all of the Hannibal Lecter movies have this kind of fantasy element to them where this old man is able to do these horrific things and manipulate bodies in ways that in reality he would never be able to do. Like you said, he's probably 60 in that movie. Like, he's not going to be able to, he doesn't have the time, he doesn't have the strength. It's just not feasible, but it's one of those things where it serves, that's the fantasy element of these kills and how he gruesomely displays bodies in horrific ways. It serves a purpose. It serves to show that this guy, no matter how smart he is, no matter how charming he can be, at the same time, like, if you ever give him a moment where you're not paying attention, like that, he can do the most grueling thing imaginable.
Right. And I mean, I think the big takeaway from this podcast that we have very different ideas of fantasies, because
if fantasy is in like fantastical, not fantasy as in I'm trying to do that to somebody that
we should probably talk off air more about that, Jay. But
yeah, well, I'll save that for therapy.
No, but just that whole scene again where you're in a place where you think everything is safe, right? You have police everywhere. Sterling Clarice goes up there, and has a conversation with him for 5 minutes before Chitlin, sorry, I forgot.
Dr. Chitlin. Yeah.
He comes in with the police officers to kind of take her away. And there's like a small moment of connection there with Clarice and Hannibal, because he's like, oh, you forgot, your paper,
your file.
Like that. He like kind of rubs her finger in some weird, like, it's just I mean, it's not even like a sexual thing. It just seemed more he's trying to weirdly help her, or trying to, again, connect with her in some weird way that he's doing it. But that whole scene, how it plays out, again, rewatching it, like, it's not as suspenseful because you know it's going to happen, right? But what were you thinking when you first watched that? And were you like, when did it kind of hit you that, oh shit, like Hannibal's actually that guy that's in the ambulance. He's not actually the guy that's in the elevator shaft.
So I actually completely forgot that. I knew that when he was escaping, I knew that he wasn't on the elevator because he's scarily intelligent. Like, he's not going to get caught like that. But I completely forgot that he basically switches bodies with one of the guards, and he cuts off the guy's face. And then when the ambulance is out of the, drives away from the courthouse and they're on the highway, like the guy's calling for backup or whatever. And then he just takes the guy's face off and sits up in the back. Like, that was so brutal. And I completely forgot, but I want to go back to what you said about his relationship with Clarice, in that I'm so thankful that Jonathan Demme never made it like a sexual thing, because it's funny that in this world where all of the men are basically hostile to Clarice in one way or another, Hannibal Lecter never is. He's obviously a serial killer and he's Hannibal the cannibal and all that, but at the same time, he's the only male character in that film that actually like is respectful towards her in certain ways. At the when they first meet and he's like figuring her out, like you said, he kind of beats her down with a description of her that's like brutally honest. And I think it nails home for her in a lot of ways because he's right on the money when he's calling her a rube and all of these things.
Right.
But as he starts interacting with her more and more, and especially that scene, like you said earlier, with Miggs, his cellmate, or the serial killer that's housed next to Hannibal Lecter. When Miggs throws the bodily fluids at her, Hannibal Lecter calls Clarice back and he goes on this mini rant about like, I would never allow that. That's so disrespectful and all these things. And then we see what he does to Miggs. He basically uses his intellect to get Miggs to swallow his own tongue, which is just like, that's not something that you would think that anybody's capable of doing, but it's kind of just, again, shows him as being almost like the highest level of evil, that he doesn't even need to be in the same room with somebody and he can get them to kill themselves.
Right. And I envy that specific aspect of Hannibal Lecter. But but you know, I like the kind of angle that you're coming at it with, because again, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? The more the film progresses, the more, you know, kind of bullshit that she has to encounter. It seems like the more helpful that he is to her, right? He tells the senator that it's I can't remember the name of the person's name that he claims is is Buffalo Bill. He clearly tells Clarice something different. He gives her a little bit more insight that he's willing to give other folks. Again, to the point of like, there's no sexual tension or anything like that on his part. I think he comes to this more of a place as a father, because I don't know if he intuitively knows this, or if at certain conversations kind of allude to this, but so her dad obviously is dead, and she, you know, kind of explains that in one of her visions. We see that, right? I feel like he kind of ends up taking on a weird role of like a dad for her. Because again, he mentions like, you know, I if I'm going to do this, it's obviously going to be to further your career. He says that in some form or other. And again, you know, even towards the end when he calls her the day of her, you know,
inaugural
ceremony. I'm not sure what she was promoted or something.
She became an agent. That's what it was, because she was a trainee the whole film.
That's a hell of a gold star you captured.
Yeah. I think she gets a tenure right off the bat.
but yeah, so you see that, and then again, he's in, I don't know if he's in Haiti or what country he's in, to follow Chitlin.
Right. It's somewhere in the Caribbean, I think.
Which, by the way, God, I'd love to be that place right now. That'd be lovely on the beach.
Be pretty nice. Nice change of scenery.
A little cocktail. But anyways, you know, the juxtaposition of, you know, she's celebrating while he's ready on the hunt, and he's still taking that little time out of his day to reach out and be like, you know, I'm not going to hunt you down. I don't want you to think of that in the back of your mind, but I'm also not going to turn myself in, obviously. And, you know, not to skip to that far ending, but the way that the movie ends with him just eerily walking behind Chitlin and, you know, those whoever he has, it's another one of those little like sprinkles on top of this movie that it adds such another eeriness and dread to like, okay, well, he's gonna kill again, obviously. Where the heck is this gonna go, right?
Yeah, well, again, like in that where he's stalking Chilton, actually, and Anthony Hopkins in an interview said he played that like he was a cat stalking its prey. It's another example of us being told what's about to happen visually rather than showing us. Like, they could have very easily added another 10 minutes on with him killing Dr. Chitlin. And it's just like, we don't need to see that. I think it's more disturbing that he's just very coolly and calmly stalking him through the crowd. And we've already seen what Hannibal Lecter is capable of. So our imagination is going to think of something more twisted than anything that they could have shown us. But to go back to their relationship, I don't know if I would agree it's like a father-daughter thing. I think it is definitely, to an extent, a kind of mentor relationship, because he becomes infatuated with her, not sexually, but just at one point he says like the world's better with her in it. And he has this idea, he says, so long as you don't call on me, I'm not going to call on you, in terms of like, you don't hunt me, I'm not going to have to hunt you, so don't worry about it. But at the same time, it's very much, he says something interesting early on where he says he thinks of all of his past patients as experiments. He basically winds up patients that are unstable, and he wants to see what they're going to do because to amuse his own sick
Super
interests.
unsettling.
I I think to a certain extent he's doing that with Clarice in that she proves intellectually she's intelligent, which is why he becomes kind of infatuated with her in a certain way. But at the same time, he doesn't know that she's capable of defending herself. She's a trainee. Like, she doesn't have any, for lack of a better word, combat experience. So the idea that he's sending this person on their own to go hunt down a serial killer that's killed 5 or 6 other women without backup, like, I view that as him setting up another experiment. Because essentially, she unofficially becomes his patient in a way. Like, he breaks her down. He kind of taps into her fears and traumas, where he gets her to admit this whole story about like the Silence of the Lambs, where the lambs wouldn't stop crying. She tapping into that childhood that was very traumatic. And so he winds her up basically and sends her off with the clues that help her find Buffalo Bill. But at the same time, there's no way for him to know the outcome. So it's kind of this idea that he's just interested to see what will happen, right, to a certain extent.
It's like a scientist and you have a bunch of different lab rats and you inject them with something or you put them in various situations and it's like which one's going to find the cheese and which one's going to kind of electrocute themselves. And
yeah,
Clarice was, found a way to kind of survive it. I mean, looking back at that movie, was there a moment where you were like, all right, this is one of the better movies I've seen? Or was there a moment where it kind of disappointed you in some aspect?
I think what I appreciate a lot more is how seamlessly it blends a lot of genres. Because, this is a horror podcast, but at the same time, this is not necessarily a horror movie. It's more about like a psychological thriller. There are certain aspects that certainly I find fall into the horror umbrella. But the ways in which Jonathan Demme subverts a lot of our expectations, because like I said earlier, the setup for this feels kind of procedural. Like, I assumed that in rewatching it, when I start to see like her training, she's getting these clues, she's going to go investigate this crime scene. I was like, am I misremembering? Is this movie more kind of like CSI-ish, like a formula? But then you see how it starts to tap into like Hannibal Lecter and the psychology aspect. Then you have the brief kind of like slasher aspect where we see Buffalo Bill using the night vision goggles to abduct that first girl. And then, of course, we see what he gets up to in the basement and whatnot. But it kind of just effortlessly jumps between those moments. And then Clarice has her kind of like Nancy Drew moments where she's investigating the garage looking for clues. And I was just really impressed in the fact that the movie has all of these different kind of genres that it dabbles in, but the tone remains throughout. Like, the movie is consistently tense. It's consistently disturbing, and it never really loses its focus, despite the fact that we have an investigative part. We have kind of a horror slasher part, if you even want to call it. It's not really fair to call that Buffalo Bill stuff slasher stuff, but just a more traditional horror thing where like, I'm going to pick out these women and I'm going to start cutting their skin off and all this grotesque shit. And then the CSI stuff, like with the moths and everything, like it's just a very well-rounded film that I feel it fully utilizes its runtime. Like, there's no real downtime in the entire movie.
I agree with that. So let me ask you this. I mean, you've obviously, you have a good, kind of plethora of experiences in the horror genre. Is Buffalo Bill one of the scariest, horror villains? And would you actually put Hannibal Lecter, would you say that he's more of a scarier kind of a version of that? Or is Buffalo Bill worse in your kind of regard?
I think I think Ted Levine, who plays Buffalo Bill, is fantastic, especially when in thinking like what his other roles are. I'd only ever seen him play like a cop in something else. And so to go back and realize that this is a younger Ted Levine was very impressive because I'd never seen him in anything like this. Like, as not only this is obviously a physical transformation for him to play that character, but like also just psychologically, the way that he portrays Buffalo Bill as being very not only manipulative, but then he's jumping in and out of these different personas, trying to figure out who he is himself, is incredibly disturbing. And one of the scariest parts of the movie is where Clarice pulls her gun on him when she realizes who he is, and he starts laughing. And it's just like he's so warped and demented at this point that it's like he thinks it's funny that he got caught.
Right.
And it's like that just shows like how forget like the skin suits and the man vagina whatever dance, like forget all that. Like the fact that he's so out there lost it that his reaction to being caught is just a laugh, like that's super disturbing to me. I think Hannibal Lecter is a scarier villain just because the idea that he uses his strength to kill people, obviously, like he kills those cops, but at the same time, like his intellect, I think, is more terrifying. And it's what made that original performance, I think, so memorable in that up until that point, like a majority of villains, it's like they're the villain because of their strength or because we see them rip people apart or all of these different things. It was very rarely they were scary because of their intellect.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. I mean, there's like, we don't ever really see, we have theories on who the Zodiac is, right? Like, we don't obviously understand there's some sort of intellect behind that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, Buffalo Bill, I think the scariest part of this movie for me wasn't when, you know, he captures that victim, the senator's daughter, or when, you know, he's laughing eerily down at her as she's screaming and, you know, kind of doing some weird, you know, repping his shirt or whatever the heck. Mm-hmm. That right. I
mocking her. Basically.
Yeah, exactly. I think it really is that moment where whatever music was playing to kind of, you know, accentuate, I guess, the fear that Jodie Foster was feeling, Clarice was feeling when he's asking, so have you guys, like, are you guys close to finding anyone? Have you found any fingerprints? And she's again realizing this whole scene is, oh, okay, this is Buffalo Bill. I'm in the shit right now. That was probably the scariest moment for me in this whole movie, because again, the emotion that you see on her face, and then fast forward again, you know, 2-3 minutes later when she's in that room and he turns off the lights and he has the so again that he was, you know, you want that first woman, and you can see again, she just does such a phenomenal job acting in this, because that's how I would be, and that's how I used to be when my parents would mess with me and they'd turn off.
This film tapped into some childhood trauma for you?
Yeah. not Buffalo Bill trauma, thankfully.
Well, yeah, no. Again, that would be a podcast for another, or a podcast therapy session. Different. But yeah, I think that finale, let's jump right into that finale, because that, I love, again, this kind of ties into the fantastical aspects of the horror of this movie, that even though it feels exaggerated, but it's done so well, and it's conveyed so in such a disturbing way that it works really well. Like, how fucking big is that basement? That basement just goes on forever. Like, you see an outside shot of the house and it's just a simple 2-3 story house, but then the basement is like the size of a football field because of all these.
Yeah, it seems.
But at the same time, like, there are so many. It turns into a labyrinth basically. Yeah. And you see all of these different rooms and all how each room is basically reveals a different characteristic of Buffalo Bill. Like, he's got the well, he's got the sewing shop, he's got the moth sanctuary, I guess we'll call it. And then we see that he uses the night vision goggles again, which I completely forgot about because he only uses it once in the movie, and that was an hour previously. And then again, we get this depiction of his deteriorating sanity the farther down the well, so to speak, that he falls, and that instead of he could have killed her in the first 30 seconds of the lights being out, but instead he chooses to stalk her and then like run his fingers through her hair and all this stuff, and it just shows how depraved he is, that he doesn't give a shit what happens to him eventually. He's just kind of like living in the adulation of the moment.
Right. I mean, I think to a certain extent at that point, no matter how crazy he is, I think there is some sort of understanding that, okay, the jig is up, right? Like, if there's one officer here, it's only a matter of time. And I think at one point, correct me if I'm wrong, I think she even yells when she's in that room with the girl, like in that tunnel room, and you know, she can't feasibly get her out by herself. alone while doing it and protecting them. So he yells out, yeah, the other officers are on their way soon, to give him the, okay, so it doesn't, give him the understanding that no matter what happens in this situation, you're going to get caught. So again, I think that's why instead of like, hitting her over the head with the pistol or trying to, tackle her or something, he ends up, clicking back the gun to shoot her. I'm obviously not a gun nut, so I apologize if I butchered that. But
it's okay. The hammer.
Yeah, sure, whatever. He obviously hears that and shoots him. And again, it just compounds the anxiety that we all feel for her, where it slows down on him, and like you can see a little bit of the illuminating light of the night vision goggles when the camera's pan to him, and then back to Starling, and she's completely in the dark. She has no idea what's going on. I think that's a really good kind of analogy for the whole movie, where she's kind of in the dark on a lot of things, and she's just trying to kind of fight her way out. And she's able, with various clues, to do that, and ultimately, obviously, be the hero of it.
Yeah, I think that finale is so well done. Again, is that even you have such a strong female character that is very much outside the box in terms of like films of the 90s. I feel like, especially early 90s, all of these big action movies came out and they were all male. So it feels like during that era, at least, there was like very male dominated. Not to say that much has changed in that regard now, but at the same time, like she's on her own and she has to overcome these insurmountable odds seemingly. And no matter what, it shows that she's able to kind of persevere through everything. Like, she's one-on-one with the serial killer and the lights are off now and she can't see, and the serial killer has the upper hand, and she still manages to kill him in the end. And I think, again, it kind of just shows that she is such a strong figure in the film itself that no matter what, she's going to be able to overcome it. But yeah, this was, I mean, I really enjoyed watching this film. Obviously, I'm in the middle of rewatching the TV series which is on Netflix right now, and I did a review last week, I believe, on it. But if you dig Silence of the Lambs, like this is the strongest film. I don't know that personally. I would recommend people watch Silence of the Lambs and then watch the Hannibal TV series, and then maybe go see Hannibal or Red Dragon.
I can't speak to that fully. All I could just tell you is I will always remember that scene in Red Dragon. I think it's the most iconic scene of all of them, where he has that reporter like glued into that wheelchair, and he pushes him down like a hill. I don't know why, but after I saw that at like 12 years old, I was like, I don't want any part of a serial killer. And then the other thing is, I apologize. I do have some fava beans waiting for me.
Well, yeah, that's a good, I don't want to keep you from your fava beans, but as always, man, I appreciate having you on. This was a ton of fun.
I appreciate you having me on. And obviously I love doing these and love listening to all your work, man. So, keep up the good stuff, Jay.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Daily Horror Habit podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service, and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram or @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.